Hello, my name is Stanford Gibson. I'm the Sediment Transport Specialist at HEC, and this is a talk and demonstration I gave as part of a class, an online class on screening level sediment analysis on the effective discharge and computing the effective discharge. This is actually the second part of a two-part talk. The first one was given by my colleague John Shelley. That talk is also on YouTube, where he talks about other ways of computing the channel forming discharge, which is the bank full and the recurrence interval. But then this one really burrows down into how to compute an effective discharge. The talk has some theory at the front end, and then an example application in Excel. And then I wrap up with some thoughts on bin size and choosing nonlinear bin size for flashy systems. And there are links to each of those intermediate sets of material in the description if you want to jump right to one of them. But with that, let's get started.
Okay, so some of you noticed that John talked about 3 methods, but then he only talked about 2. And the bank full flow, the recurrence interval, and then the effective discharge. That's because the effective discharge is something we want to spend a little bit more time on. Because the effective discharge is kind of presumptively a repeatable computation that doesn't have the same liabilities as using the recurrence interval, as it being different for different systems. And it's not as qualitative as bank full flow. Now, it does turn out to have its own issues. So really the way that we try to do this is take the portfolio approach, look at what these 3 different flows are, and see if they come together to tell a story. But effective discharge is definitely a computation we want to do. So just a little terminology first, because we're throwing around a lot of terms. The channel forming discharge is this theoretical flow that should produce the same channel as the entire period of record. That is the same as the dominant discharge. Those terms mean approximately the same. They're almost synonyms. The effective discharge is not a synonym. The effective discharge, to use a Venn diagram, is a way of computing the channel forming discharge, but is not synonymous. The effective discharge is its own idea, and that is, it's the flow that moves the most sediment over time. Now, in theory, the flow that moves the most sediment in time is the one that probably forms your channel, and therefore it probably is also the bank full flow. That's what kind of geomorphic theory states. Whether that's true from case to case is another idea, but they're not identical. Effective discharge is one way of computing a channel forming discharge. And so this comes from Woolman and Miller, which is one of the most famous papers in geomorphology. And back in the 1960s, when they wrote these papers, you could have a little fun with journal papers. That is over. You're no longer allowed to have fun with journal papers. But so what Woolman and Miller did in their introduction is they started out with a little parable of magical woodcutters. This is the story they tell in the beginning of their paper. They say, imagine that you have these 3 woodcutters. You have a fairy goes out to chop some wood, and the fairy can chop wood all day, but each swing of the axe is not very effective. And so the fairy just can chop wood forever, but doesn't do a lot of work each time. And then you have a giant, and the giant will go out there and take these big swoops of the axe, but can only really do a couple of those before he has to take a nap. And you can have all sorts of issues with Woolman and Miller's taxonomy of magical creatures, but we have to kind of posit their assumptions. And so they're actually not going to do a lot of work either, because they spend so much time sleeping, and they only do these big effective swings once in a while. And then, this is a little speciesist, but, Woolman and Miller said, you can imagine like a human woodcutter. And they go out and they do a 9-hour day, and they keep at it, and each of their swings is pretty effective. And over the course of time, who's going to chop the most wood? And they posit that this intermediate magical creature, the Homo sapien, is the one that's actually going to chop the most wood, because they have reasonable work over a reasonable period of time. And that's the basic idea of the effective discharge, is that the low flows work at the channel all the time, but don't do a lot of work. And the really high flows, sediment transport's nonlinear. They do a massive amount of work, but they're so rare that they don't actually form the channel. It's these intermediate flows that the channel sees every year or every other year that are big enough to do work, big enough, they're competent to move the sediment, but they're frequent enough that the channel will form around them. And so that's the idea of the effective discharge. And so the way that we're going to compute that is that we're going to plot the frequency of the occurrence of flows. And if you were to plot the frequency of flows, now those of you who are used to flood statistics, we're going to think about flows a little bit differently here. This is more the way that like ecological studies think about flows, because we're interested in the whole range of flows. We're not just interested in the high exceedance probabilities. And so the frequency of flows, you have some unlikely droughts and you have some unlikely floods, but things tend to cluster around a mean, and then the Bank-Fuller 2-year event is actually a low probability event. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use a sediment rating curve to translate these flows into a sediment load. And so we'll take the flow, and at some flow, the flow isn't competent to move sediment. And there is like often a starting point, but we're just going to say that, at low flows, there's just not a lot of transport. And so we're going to use our power function to compute the sediment transport for each of these flows. Okay, so now what we have, for each flow along the x-axis, we have a frequency of occurrence and a load. And so how are we going to decide which flow does the most work? Which flow moves the most sediment? Well, we'll take the load and we'll multiply it by the frequency of that load associated with the frequency of that flow. And so the product of the frequency times the transport or the load is the variable that we'll look at. And so this product of frequency times load, you plot that and you pick the largest product of frequency and load, and that is your effective discharge. That is the flow that moves the most sediment. Okay, this is something that you should be able to compute. And so what we're going to do next is we're actually going to compute a effective discharge. And so I've given you about 51 years of flows. We're going to compute an effective discharge for this system. And so I'm going to walk you through the steps in this demonstration. Do this, you need the data analysis tool pack in Excel. Now, many of you probably already have the data analysis tool pack loaded, but if you're like me, Office 365 just got pushed, and so you're going to have to reload it. So everything that I show you, I've actually put step-by-step in the workshop instructions, including a link to how to load the data analysis tool pack. If you do this a lot, then it's going to be pretty familiar to you. If not, then I think that you're going to really appreciate this new tool. Okay, so we're going to go to File. That's where it is. File, Options. And then we're going to go to Add-ins. And you'll choose Excel Add-ins, Go. And then you'll choose the analysis tool pack. Thank you, Justin. I was looking for add-ins under File. That was silly. And so this is where it is. Go ahead and add the tool pack. And what that'll do, the way you know it worked, is if you go to Data now there's a Data Analysis tab that wasn't there before. And this actually has a lot of really powerful stuff in it. It has like ANOVAs and lots of really cool statistical analysis. Okay, so I've given you a flow series and a load rating curve. And so the first step is going to be to make a flow duration curve. So we'll call this flow duration. And so what you'll want to do is you're going to select all the data, Control Shift down, and I'm just going to sort them from smallest to largest. Which is the A to Z button. And continue with the current section. And what this will do is this will sort my data from the smallest flow, which is 478, to the largest flow, which is 8,748. Okay, and then I'm just going to rank them. And to rank them, I'll just go, this is number 1. This is number 2. Oh, I'm going to have to turn those into numbers. So I'll format the cells and turn them into numbers. And then I'll drop that down. So now each one of these has a rank from smallest to largest. And then I will insert a column. And now I'm going to compute percent exceeded. So percent exceeded is just the maximum rank minus the rank divided by the maximum rank. And then we want to fix these maximum ranks with dollar signs. So you can press F4 to get your dollar signs, or just type in the dollar signs. You can press percentage to get the percentage. And so now these all have a percent exceeded. If you go and plot this, you now have what we call a flow duration curve. And so you can pick off the percentage of time that any flow is exceeded in your system. And so I think I ask you, what's the medium flow in your system? Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to get the frequency of each flow. But you don't really actually want the frequency of each flow. That doesn't make any sense, because 4,356 will happen exactly once, right? So what does it actually mean to get a frequency of the flow? That's where this method gets a little bit weird. And frankly, no one ever told me about this. Until I started doing these analyses, people only showed me this plot, and it looked really nice and elegant, and I thought, why would anyone ever do this any other way? Until I realized that choosing your bins is where this gets really messy. And so you have to choose flow bins that you're going to do this analysis with. I've tried a bunch of bins, and you can try other bins if you want. Sometimes linear bins work. For the Rio de la Plata, we needed nonlinear bins. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But let's use bins of 500 CFS. Okay, so I'm just going to create a series of bins that are that increase in increments of 500 that cover my range of flows. So those are the bins that I'm going to create essentially a histogram with. We're going to generate a histogram of frequency. And that's where the data analysis tool pack comes in. If you go to data and data analysis, you can choose a histogram. These are all the cool tools in the data analysis tool pack. The histogram is by far the most commonly used. So I'm going to choose that. And then you need to put in an input range. Here you're going to choose all of your input data. You got about 18,000 flows. And then you're going to choose your bin range. And that's going to be these bins that you just created right here. And then you need to tell it where you want to put the output. And so I'll put it there. Okay. And then I say okay. And magically, Excel tells me the number of observations associated with each of these bins. Now, kind of unhelpfully, the bin is associated with the upper bound. You can see that there are 2 between 0 and 500, and there are 6,000 between 500 and 1,000. So what should we actually represent this bin is? This bin isn't actually 1,000 CFS, and so the actual flow that I'm going to associate that bin with is an average of the low and the high. And then this is going to be an average of the high and the lowest flow observed. Okay, so now we can do flow frequency, but I like to actually break this down into percentage. And so if we just say, hey, this is going to be this divided by the sum of all the observations. And we'll add the dollar signs to that to fix them. And then we'll turn that into percent. Now you can see that about a third of the flows are between 500 and 1,000, and about a third are between 1,000 and 1,500, and things tail off from there. So this is your frequency plot. Okay, so now we need to generate a load for each of these flows. And so if we go back and we have this flow load rating curve, which we developed in the way we just talked about. So for each of these flows, we're going to compute a load, 0.0002 times this average flow raised to the 1.8. And so now we have a flow associated with each of these loads. So now we can plot flow versus frequency and load. And you're going to want to plot these on different scales. So we're going to format the data series and give it a secondary axis. And what you can see here is you've got your frequency of flows and you've got your loads, which raise nonlinearly. And so now you're just going to multiply your frequency times your load, and that's going to be the parameter that you're going to use to determine your effective discharge. And the maximum value, the flow associated with the maximum value of that product is your effective discharge. Okay, so here's what I believe about this. I don't like teaching classes where I just show you a picture and then in 5 years when you actually have to do this calculation, you have to make it up by yourself. So that's one of the reasons that I actually having you walk through a couple of these computations so that you'll at least have done them once. And I think it also helps solidify the concepts in your mind when you actually walk through the computations and run into some of the complexities.
So there's one more complexity that you might run into in these analyses, and that's with flashy streams. You know, if you're dealing with a stream that rises and falls on multiple days and has kind of a standard large river statistical distribution or flow duration curve, then arithmetic or linear bends like we just did will work. But if your stream is flashy, they will not. And so to illustrate this, let's go to the Rio de la Plata in northern Puerto Rico. The Rio de la Plata is a standard island, tropical island river. And what you'll see is that the Rio de la Plata is fed by a high gradient, kind of mountainous but small watershed. And so you'll get hurricanes that dump a lot of water on this mountainous watershed. And so you'll get some very high flows, but these hydrographs will rise and fall very quickly. And so here's the DSS hydrograph for the Rio de la Plata, and you can definitely pick out the hurricane events. But what you'll notice is that these are 15-minute data. And the reason these are 15-minute data is because this event of record, like most of these hurricane events, because it's just small, high gradient watershed, will completely rise and fall in about 36 hours. And so the vast majority of the time series is these really low base flows, which means that if you use linear or arithmetic bends like we did in the last example for your effective discharge analysis, you are going to have a problem. And here's the problem. So again, because these are 15-minute data, you can't really do this in Excel. It really bogs down because it's over 1 million cells. And so I did this in R. And here we have the effective discharge analysis for the Rio de la Plata with 1,500 CFS arithmetic or linear bins. So, 500, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, those are the bins. And so the blue is the flow duration curve, the brown is the load curve, and then the gray is the product. And you can see that the flow duration curve, almost all of the flows fall into this first 0 to 500 CFS bin. And so when you take the product, even though transport is very low, you get your effective discharge in that lowest bin. And that's very common for these flashy systems. Even with a bin of 1,000, you get the same thing. almost all of your flows fall into this first 1000 CFS bin, and so your effective discharge is just the average of that first bin. But if you use nonlinear bins, and so what I like to do is I like to make each bin twice the previous bin. So my bins are 1 CFS, 2 CFS, 4 CFS, 8 CFS, 16, and on until 1024, 2048, and so forth, so that each bin kind of doubles the previous bin. Then you start to get something that makes more sense. I had an interaction with David Biedenharn on this. David Biedenharn's done a lot more effective discharges than anyone else in the Corps. He's one of the Corps sediment transport specialists. And he says he'll often, with the Mississippi or these larger rivers, he'll use an arithmetic or linear approach, but he'll always use a log approach as well, something that's nonlinear, in order to determine which approach is better. And so in this case, you'll see now we're actually getting something that looks like a effective discharge. Our effective discharge comes out to 25,000 CFS, which it turns out is actually the bank full flow and almost exactly the 2-year event. For a generally unmodified system, all of the points of evidence converge to a channel forming discharge around 25,000 CFS. And so for these smaller, flashier systems, you're going to have to be a little creative about using nonlinear bins, and your answer will be sensitive to the nonlinear bin, which does affect the repeatability of this analysis. There is some subjective judgment in this analysis, and so I'll try a number of different bins and look to see kind of which ones converge on the answer. All right, so there's a very brief overview to how to compute an effective discharge analysis. And if you're interested in additional information, this reference by Soar and Thorne, Channel Restoration Design for Meandering Rivers, is really the primary reference on this kind of analysis, as well as many other of these screening level sediment analyses that you can do when considering a channel modification.